this computer? Yes. Well, Pamela, thank you so much for making time for this conversation.
My pleasure.
And for me, it's really already been a lovely learning journey to have this conversation series that I seem to be doing. I'm surprised that's what's emerging. I'm calling it the Regeneration Rising, conversations about regenerative practice. And I already had a really nice conversation with Jason Twill that Dominique Hess dropped in on. She couldn't make the whole call, and we were talking a lot about the connections between both Australian and Maori indigenous wisdom, and how they actually see resonance with the kind of thinking and the intention that is in regenerative practice, and how they can mutually fertilize each other, those wisdom traditions to some extent. And I also, Jason really deeply opened up with a personal story. So when I yesterday talked to Bill, I also asked him to really start with, if regenerative practice is fundamentally different from all these other practices, because it really acknowledges that the work really starts within, and that ultimately it's about shifting consciousness, ways of seeing, the way that we ask questions and observe ourselves in how we even frame how to respond to the question, how we can add value and regenerate a place. I would love to hear how you got into all of this, and what was the stories, what were the moments where you just felt called to do this kind of work, and then inform yourself on how to do it so well.
Specifying moments is always interesting. Let me start with a more general statement. I kind of popped into life as I think from early days, a very strong advocate, proselytizer sort of personality. So a lot of my life, early life in school and college and in the few years afterwards, were filled with peace movement, with civil rights. I mean, I was out there sure that we were going to transform the world and do it next week if we could just think and push hard enough. And that was a lot of my, I was out organizing things at Stanford around the Vietnam War in 1962, and nobody even heard of it at that point in our area. But that kind of carried me forward. I felt it was really important to be responsible and take a role. And then I got one of those sort of up the side the head events, and our daughter got cancer. And she was bone cancer. She was 11 when that happened. And she was truly one of these old souls, just quite remarkable human being. And we traveled that journey with her for 3 years. And one of the things that I learned that she helped teach me and many other people was how ephemeral the kind of functional things we do and successes we see, and how exterior they are to what and who we really need to be. And so during the time I'd been working with Carol Sanford, I mean, our daughters met when they were 2 years old and were best of friends. And so that's what sort of started that relationship. And so Carol and I had been working on a number of things, and she had started going to Charlie Crone's sessions and working with that group. And so she'd bring back and we'd talk about what she's doing, and I'd go out and bring it into my practice. And so all this was while dealing with the family and Jessica and supporting her. And so it was in the background hovering, but not the central focus. So the thing that I got out of that was there's a saying that Gurdjieff, who's sort of one of the key people in fourth way work, which was part of the lineage of this work, is man cannot do. And I didn't really ever understand that until that experience. And I thought, sitting there with her, I cannot do, but I can be and become something that can make a difference.
Yeah,
But I don't know how
this,
the hell to do that.
this reminds me of the one of my favorite Gurdjieff quotes is, we have to stop thinking of ourselves as beings that do, and have to start thinking of ourselves as doings that be. And that's exactly.
Matthew Fox is a similar statement. He said we should call ourselves human doings because of the way we focus. Yeah. So a couple of weeks after Jessica died, I went for the first time to actually sit in and with Charlie's sessions. And so it was, one of the things that it did for me was coming in that place and state was to be really present with not the functional knowledge things that were going on in the session, but the energy and the quality of energy and being that was present took on a tangibility for me that I had never really experienced before. So that was my entry to this work. And a lot of people, when we talk about what we're working on is shifting thinking, tend to think of it as an intellectual process. And it's always challenging to people to say, and as an intellectual process, it doesn't have heart, it's abstract. And it's a challenge for people to get over that, because we are so firmly taught in Western culture that thinking is about in intellectual exercise. It's actually a functional process. So that's how I got involved, and it was it gave me time to sort of really. I think the question I was asking was, what kind of instrument do I need to be?
Mm.
And it took me, a couple of years to figure that out. I worked with, because the Institute was focused around business.
Mm.
That was the way to get involved. I'd always been in social causes, community organizing, and so on. And this shifted. I learned an enormous amount as a result of working in business. I was happy to leave it behind as soon as I could.
Same here. Could you say a little bit more? So this was the institute that Charlie Crone ran, or like, what were Charlie Crone's sessions?
There was something called the network,
mm-hmm.
which was a network of consultants who worked and learned together from a particular lineage. And Charlie was probably, there were three folks who were kind of core to the formation of that. And the roles they described for themselves had to do with right being, right action, and right knowledge, as opposed to hierarchy. And Charlie's role was right knowledge. And that really was appropriate, because that was his work. I mean, it just was continually weaving together multiple lineages, some very ancient, some more recent, David Bohm to the Sufis, to Gurdjieff and John Bennett. Systematics was a very big part of it. But it was right knowledge in the sense of knowing, not a thing known, but the process of knowing. And I think that's a really critical distinction to make. I think it's one of the reasons why this work feels more resident to Indigenous people, is that the understanding of knowledge as knowing, a process that's continuing going, is very much more akin than the Western sense of knowledge as a thing known. In that sense.
This is fascinating, because Bill and I spoke about this yesterday, that this work is dynamic. So on the one hand, it is completely built on a deep lineage of these people. and then it's constantly evolving. So it's not a kind of going back to Bennett in that sense, but always being informed and inspired and revisiting these frameworks to then bring them into a even more appropriate application in right now, right here.
I think the key word in there and what you just said, Daniel, is evolving, because we have a tendency in the West to sort of run into some wall or difficulty and say, okay, this doesn't work anymore, we'll find something else. Or we want to find our own distinctive place, and so we give it a new name and say, this is much better. We're doing this with sustainability now.
Exactly.
It's interesting to see, suddenly the sustainability isn't good enough, it's a failure, it's not far enough. And nobody seems to be asking, well, maybe we didn't really understand what sustainability meant in the sense of a living world. So evolving, if you look at the sciences, Einstein moved science far away from Newton, but he didn't negate what Newton found. He encompassed it in a larger picture of understanding. And Bohm did the same thing. So I'd like to think that what's happening with this work is that as it evolves, it's encompassing in a larger understanding and deeper understanding, not changing. But it requires really understing what's at the core of this work.
It's sort of this dynamic. Like what comes to mind is the spiral again. Yeah, I mean, in Wilber's frame, it would be called transcend and include rather than transcend and exclude.
Yes.
So to build on it, and also when you think of it as a developmental pathway, as an evolutionary pathway, the entire pathway has to be available to people on the learning journey, on their personal development journey, in order for them to find the entry point where they're at. And so in that sense, it is dynamic and it's co-present, but there's always an evolving edge that pushes it.
It's a gyre, I think, not just a spiral, but it's actually moving, encompassing more as it moves up. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I've really come to appreciate the importance of understanding something, which is different from knowledge about it. Before I try to evolve or build on it or extend it in some way. In many ways, what for us evolution is about and regeneration is, if we don't understand what's at the core essence of something and we try to improve it, we end up imposing a pattern we're bringing in from somewhere else. And we see this has happened over and over again in Western colonial times, in science, in business, in the way we plan cities. With the best of intentions, we are looking to improve, but we don't truly understand what's at the core heart that makes something who and what it is. And that's at the very, very heart of what we are working with in this particular cosmology and ontology and technology that makes up what we're doing.
I find this fascinating to me personally on two levels, because on the one hand, it's the working with the potential rather than the problem, working with the like really being place sourced and working with the knowledge that whatever you do in any place, no matter how small or how large, if you're working bioregionally, it's co-present with the whole world. So you actually, the local world is also global work. But then at the same time, as you were saying that, I was sort of tugging on my own mask, or it was landing in me also with the sense that with regard to that long lineage that you're just describing, that has been nurtured by people like Charlie Crone, you, Carol, and people in Regenesis, I absolutely and joyfully am a humble apprentice, still learning the depth of that frame. And I guess my excitement about wanting to have a conversation before I maybe even fully, deeply understand it to the depth of it, is that it so strongly resonates with the two other main influences in my own thinking, because and it has a lineage connection because Henry Bortoft and his wonderful book A Goethean, The Wholeness of Nature, A Goethean Way of Science, and this almost phenomenological approach that Goethe brought in, that was reminding us to stay present with how we bring the world into being, how our organizing ideas actually shape what we think is out there, but it's not. We've created it by the way we're in relation with it. That was really, really influential for me when I was at Schumacher College in 2001, 2002, and I worked with Henry directly. And then about 10 years later, no, like 7 years later, actually, I was in Findhorn running a UNITAR workshop on, I think it was zero carbon housing and sustainability in the built environment or something. And somebody signed up, and Alice, my wife, who at the time was the secretary for this UNITAR training center that I was working with, said, check out the website of this person who's just signed up. They're called Decision Integrity. They're down in Pitlochry, and I think you'll like the website. So I looked at the website, and it was Tony Hodgson's website. And Tony is in the IFF that he later invited me into, the International Futures Forum. And the connection here is that Tony was in J.G. Bennett's research lab, the head of research. And Henry, who was Boehm's PhD student at Birkbeck College, came and worked at Cold Springs as well. And so both of them in very different ways, Tony with this world systems map that you can see behind me there, and with the work with Three Horizons and all the frameworks that are curated within H3 Uni and the International Futures Forum, gave me so much. And then Henry with this particular attention to our way of seeing being so central. And that's why I'm so excited and maybe a little bit too full of energy to explore where these things can meet.
Yeah, no, they do. And I mean, phenomenology is another core to this work. And it's, I mean, one of the things that when we were working on developing Regenesis, Charlie was, and bringing it into all of the sessions that we folks were involved in with him, he started using that to be able to bring people who were much not in that world, much more business oriented, into beginning to experience things from that level more explicitly. And it's the term we use often when we talk about storing place and trying to first really experience the essence and core, what's the core patterns of a place, is to step in and walk around and be conscious of how that place is processing us. Mm-hmm. We are literally being processed all the time by the places. It's another way of saying, and this was Charlie's phrase that he was using with the group who was working with a vineyard, a bio dynamic vineyard, one of the first ones they were trying to set up. And he used that phrase. He said, just walk around and observe how it's processing you. Now that takes consciousness of what's going on inside of us. And that's one of the things I actually would like to talk about, Daniel, because I think there's a lot of exciting and wonderful things being written now, shared, disseminated everywhere around, things like regenerative agriculture, regenerative economies, and so on. It's a really optimistic and powerful and hopeful time in all of that happening. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that we've been doing is sort of saying, okay, this is great, because when we started, regeneration had to do with biology. That you couldn't find it anywhere else, or regenerative breaks maybe in the 90s. It was such an obscure sort of thing. So it feels, it's finally now taking its place. So what is our role and the role of our work in this now vastly, quickly expanding ecosystem. Where can we uniquely contribute value in it? And it's an ongoing dialogue with us. It's part of how we work on continuing to evolve what we can bring. And as I look out and read the thing, one of the things that keeps coming to me is something you referred to as sort of self-development or personal development. And I think people don't have, when they hear those terms, they hear them through the filter of the way we normally think about things like personal development or self-development. And so I want to just address that a little bit, because I think that's one of the things that we do and have developed a way of enabling people to work that's distinctive to this. So it sort of starts with the reality that we as humans exist in essentially two worlds, you could say. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay. So we've got an intrinsic world we live in and an extrinsic world, and they're always both at the same time. And the intrinsic world is all about, it's an inner world, and it's kind of the mental processing that goes on in that, if we're aware of it, is sort of signals to us who we want to be, what's going on, how we want to behave in a situation, so on. Most of the time, we're not even aware of that mental processing. Most of our thinking is about the extrinsic, which is what to do about the world out there, what we should be doing in relationship to it. The issue then becomes when we are unconscious of that intrinsic processing, which is developing how we respond and engage with the world, and we don't even see that. And we're only looking at the outside. We tend to become reactive beings. That's what leads to this emphasis on doing, because we're not engaged. So one of the core pieces in this work, when we work, we call it actually, it's a developmental process, but we're always working on actualization and realization, working on being able to manifest new effectiveness and capabilities while realizing greater potential, and never separating those two, because that's at the core of that Geyer you were talking about. So the challenge is, how do we become conscious in the moment of how we are processing our world and processing our thinking in ourselves?
Wouldn't you say that is at the core of personal development? Like ultimately, like even the conventional understanding of personal development is leading up to that point where you can feel a reaction rising, and then you can reflect on how your own filters and your own triggers have produced that reaction before you then respond to the situation.
I think it's at the core when it is really truly self-actualizing. But most of the practices for working on that are about going off and into a retreat or meditation or all of those are really valuable and important processes. I don't want to, they all have a role at different times and places. What we work on is, how do you actually use life moment by moment as a school for working on that in oneself. And so it requires more will and discipline to be able to do that. But if we're really going to evolve who we are and our being, we have to do it while we're working. And so a lot of the practices and the frameworks that we use are, and the kind of working together to support each other, to be friends in the work of this, is about bringing that into a meeting at work, a presentation to a client. It's like, how can I bring that consciousness of the inner processes and how it's affecting the outer, and bring them into harmony while I'm striving to actually do something significant. And it certainly is bolstered by meditation practices and by retreat practices, but ultimately that's where it's got to be brought to bear if we're really going to make the change that from being human doings to human beings.
I'm curious whether, like, because as you were speaking about this with regard to how you function internally as a team within Regenesis, and when you do the work as a community, I somehow had this
We aspire, how we aspire to work.
I was briefly reminded in me of the kind of rite of passage work or vision quest work I've done, and the importance of when you come back from the mountain and you tell your story, of the process of mirroring, of having somebody else reflect what the story you tell back to you. Is there any practice that you've developed in the team that when you like, how to gently remind somebody to take that second level observation of the own practice of observation?
Do you remember, or have you come in contact with, but one of the sort of core frameworks we introduced at the beginning of TRP is 3 lines of work?
Yeah, of course. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So if first line work is about developing the self to be able to be to fully realize one's potential, and that's another word that's kind of a soft, that gets pretty flabby, but if you sort of think of potential as the gap between what I am now and what I could be if I was fully pursuing and realizing my purpose, which means a contribution to something larger. So that would be what the actualization of if that first line work is. At second line work, I'm taking on stewardship for supporting those I'm working with to also be on that path, but always in relationship to our collective aim of contributing to something larger in the world. So that's where we get that sort of, in a sense, it's moving up, scaling, but it's different from nested holes. It's not the same thing. But it's the way we work together. And so there's a whole number of practices. Part of it is, if you to move a team, that's one of the things we're trying to do through TRP and through the regenerative practitioner courses, having study cohorts, and we'll be bringing the same thing, encouraging it as we start the co-learning network up this year, is to give people the support in structuring second line work groups, in a sense, even though it may not be in your own team or business, but it can lead to that. Ideally it is, but it's where you have friends in the work who gather together who have a similar understanding, and not necessarily all, in fact, it's better if they're not all at the same level. You always want to it's like learning tennis. You want to practice with somebody better than you, but you also gain by helping along somebody who's resourcing somebody who's coming along behind. So having those kinds of groups where people are working on their first and third line, but getting support for building the consciousness from folks who can remind you and ways to work together to do that. We just little things. I'll get an example from a course we ran in Vancouver this last fall. One of the sort of little mantras is that in this work is to start from potential, not problems. The problems we're starting from what's in the past. We had a 2-day retreat at the end of the course. And by the end of it, people were, and these were people who just met. Some of them were from the same company, but some of them had just met at the beginning of this 2.5 months. Would be listening to somebody reporting out and say, okay, David, you're solving a problem again. And they had permission to do that because they were co-learning.
Yeah.
I think that's the key thing. It's about, I'm inviting you in to my development. and I invite you with the understanding that we have a similar practice and respect for each other. But I'm inviting you to be a friend in the work to me, and I welcome being reminded. I don't want feedback. I want to just have something that just sort of wakes me up a little bit and makes me be conscious again of how I'm processing myself and in this context.
How would you do? Because that sometimes I notice that there's such a specificity of language that then also, in order to very clearly say one thing, it's in the language structure. You then create this sort of the dualist opposite, and that almost creates sort of no-nos, like case studies or feedback, or like how would you distinguish somebody kind of be reminding you to stay observant of your own processes of observing, and feedback, you're solving a problem again? Like, well, isn't feedback that as well?
No, let me, that's why I talked about the environment. It was we worked to create a particular energy field.
Mm-hmm.
People have been through a process, and they are struggling to understand, to deepen learning, to apply it together. And so they're all experiencing themselves as being on a learning path. And part of this is they're talking openly about the frameworks that they're trying to bring into their personal and professional lives to bring consciousness to it, to start to see. And we introduced you've I know it's a long time ago and you had other things on your mind in the therapy, but little things like what's the scope of our considering? Am I just internally considering, or am I actually externally considering? And what does that mean? By internally considering, everything relates to me. You know, Daniel, you're frowning. I must be doing something wrong.
Yeah.
You know, as opposed to, Daniel, you're frowning. Can I figure out what it is that's not working for you, and I can support you in that? So that builds a different relationship that has in it both explicit and implicit and this was said in a joking way. You know, it was not a chastising, but it became a little sort of a wake up signal, as a signal, as opposed to sitting someone down and saying, what I'm seeing is that you're really continuously, you step back and you start to solve problems. And usually feedback is followed by advice.
Yeah.
It's very hard for people, I've watched this over and over again, to give feedback without then giving advice because they have an answer. And what you do is you rob the person you're engaging with of their own agency.
Yeah.
And that's the really critical piece, because that's kind of the fundamental base, is without that personal agency, the sense of being able to bring will and strive to create something that I uniquely can contribute, and that's significant. It's, you know, if I look at equity, for example, one of the definitions I love that came through in this work on equity was, equity is about not an equal starting ground in a functional material way, but equal opportunity to contribute what I uniquely have to contribute. And when you start to think about it that way, then you're starting to say, what is preventing people from bringing their unique contribution? That's what we should be working on. And it's not a material thing. It's more a path. It has material implications, but it's more a path enabling that path of developing oneself and to one's full potential, and giving opportunities to be able to then contribute that potential to things that people care about. My sense is, if we were really focusing in on that, I look at what's happening in the United States, and so many of the people who see Trump as a kind of a way to justify that they have meaning, they're of value, but it's an artificial exterior affirmation, as opposed to seeing what's the real potential they could bring, providing infrastructural opportunities and learning opportunities that enable them to actually develop and bring that potential. Is a world of difference. But we've created a void because we don't do that. We don't see everybody as having unlimited potential.
How do you see this world, like with all these, like to some extent, I personally have come being faced, particularly last year, with the urgency of the climate crisis and trigger points coming in every hard and fast, and then political situations worsening and evil monsters reappearing that one had thought dead, like all that fascist and neo-fascist energy that is suddenly popping up, not just in the US, but in many other countries. I almost kind of got to a point of returning to being rather than doing, and appreciating what is, and really being with beauty and in relationship, and trusting that actually that shift, because it repatterns a new way of being in the world, has agency in itself, and is actually at the heart of it. Because if you try to respond to the crisis and you frame everything as a problem, like climate change or ecosystems collapse, rather than pay attention to where these symptoms come from, you might miss the opportunity to respond appropriately. But there's this strange paradox between urgency and radical slowing down, between global problems that could kill large parts of life on Earth, and actually only ever having one place and one time to react to it, which is local or bioregional, and now. How do you see all this work, all this capacity building, all this, like the sudden surge of attention with regard to, yes, we want regenerative futures, we want to go even beyond just being sustainable, or like I agree that the framing of not understanding sustainability as a bridge that we haven't walked across yet, and belittling it in any way is the mistaken path. But how do we build this capacity everywhere quick enough?
Well, yeah, that's thinking functionally in functional scale when you say everywhere. So let's back away.
Okay.
It's a really, I think it's a critical question for our time. And I was recently in a really interesting dialogue with an associate and somebody who's just moved to a new position. Has quite a bit of influence and looking to how to use that. You remember one of the little frameworks we use a lot, the law of three.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to sort of envision this. You've got one arrow, it's three forces. Mm-hmm. So one force is usually what's the activating or affirming force. It's what gets something started. The other force that meets it at the same plane is the restraining or receptive force, receiving force. And it's like, if we live in what Gurdjieff called a third force blind world, that's it. We just go back and forth and build force or end up compromising down. But in the three forces, there's a third force that's the reconciling. And that is the one that if we can appreciate both of the restraining and the activating force, hold that cognitive dissonance, and really appreciate what is the purpose behind each. The way this works is that third force comes in. It's like we create space for reconciling force. So in this dialogue with this friend, we were having this exact dialogue, and he was saying, "My God," he said, I hate it when they say they only have 12 years, but we only have 12 years. But yet we really need to move fast. And so I was saying yes. And if we solve it and we are the same. So I finally sent him a little law of three. And I said, so on one, we have an extinction crisis, or existential crisis, which deals with, we just may destroy ourselves. The earth probably will last after, but there's an existential crisis that is getting more and more imminent and real. We also are right now in the middle of an ontological crisis.
Yeah.
Who do we need to be as humans on our planet Earth? And what do we need to be working to bring into being? And so it's like those, if we solve one without the other, if we take that moment to just be and be in love and fields of caring and support, and we don't work on the other one, then, we aren't around to figure out what our role is supposed to be. So we need to hold them both. And what that requires, I think, is a different way. That's why working on our own state as we work out in the world is so fundamentally critical, learning how to do that. And I can't even say the number of meetings over the last 4 or 5 months that we've been in planning various things. And somebody just says, we've got to move faster. I mean, we can't sit around. And the minute you go to that state, you can my experience is I can no longer see the whole of what needs to be worked on in this moment, in this place, or in this to deal with this particular situation. So we narrow our consciousness in that moment, and we lose the ability to be effective on the crisis that we need to meet in terms of out there in the world.
Yeah, this is fascinating because for me, and on the one hand, the way you've just framed this is like in many ways, I feel this very strongly in my own life. It's this dance between even the tension between how much work do I put into weaving relationships at the bigger scales of nested wholeness, and how much attention do I put into the immediate like the local bioregional environment, and how much of that is outward and how much of that is really inward and nourishing. See, but the
but Dan, you're already balancing that. So it really is. It's the process is one of harmony. How do we harmonize this? And, harmony is not all light and it's a good harmony means every single element is playing its role in a beautiful composition. So you've got the opportunity to work regionally, to do what essentially we did in Regenesis. We spent years trying out, developing, testing, learning, coming back and trying out on the ground. And if I thought about the larger scale impact of that, especially in the early years, it wasn't that great until we began to realize that we need to be working at both levels. And that was when we set up the Institute as a way in 2012, started moving towards that aspect. But you've got the podcasts you do, the writing you do, so you've got an opportunity to take that experiential hands-on learning, extract from it, and put it into language in ways that reach out. And you also have the opportunity, that's why we talk so much about nodal interventions. You are somebody who started early on with an understanding of the importance of the nested wholes or scales and levels of life. That's how life operates. And you hit one level and deplete it, all the other levels eventually collapse. So, all right, you know that. So whatever level you're working on, as long as you're holding that in your thinking, which means you can't collapse into the urgency of now, the panic of now is really what it's coming out.
So right, but it like one day it feels incredibly exhilarating and exciting, and like a flow and meant to be and everything, and the other day I feel like, why am I torturing myself with this tension of trying to hold all this? But
Yeah.
I,
Elizabeth, John Bennett's wife,
uh,
there's some discussion about where this saying came from, but I think she is actually the one. She said that our being attracts our life, and we only get what our being is able to manage.
mm-hmm.
There's a more elegant way of saying that. But if you're, that's because you've been working on growing your state and what you are capable of handling and managing. And there's always going to be that as you're on that growing edge. What do you talk about, the evolving edge?
Yeah, exactly. It's not, nobody promised that it was going to be entirely comfortable the entire path. But I just wanted to come back to two things that bridge very beautifully where we started and where we just got to. One of them was when you earlier were saying that you were describing how you would invite people off into how's the place working on you or patterning you, or I can't remember the exact word you used.
Process, because that's a really important word.
Yeah.
Transforms, processes are what transforms something.
Mm.
So it's different from just any activity, right? It's really it's working to shift your being at some level and the energies you're experiencing that create a different state of being.
And that kind of reminded me a little bit of that flip in perspective that makes such a difference, which is, again, an indigenous insight, where indigenous cultures all over the world have been so clear that they belong to the land rather than the land could ever belong to them. So they are the land, they're expressions of the land. They are being processed constantly by the land. Their language is a process that comes out of the land. And then in a similar way, when you were saying, sharing this sense of collapsing, not being able to hold the whole, when people go into this panic mode of but we need to move faster. This reminds me strongly of the conversation I had with one of your students, Johnny Freelander from New Zealand, from the regenerative practitioner cohorts there, who as a Maori, we had this beautiful moment at the Commonwealth meeting in London, where I was able to share some of my frameworks, and he would then mirror them from his wisdom tradition perspective. And one of these that then was this concept of Wahl that they have of time. That is, again, Bennett speaks about this too, with the different hyparxes and so on, the co-presence of the future and the past in the presence, and the potential of the pattern of repatterning, or creating the future by repatterning in the present moment.
Right.
So
it's a very Buddhist view as well. The future moves toward us, not us moving towards the future.
And it, because in it comes also this sense that if everything is fundamentally a dynamic, nested wholeness, co-evolving mutuality, then every conversation has agency. And there is no such thing. The people who say we have to move faster think that they're not moving when they're having these conversations. And I'm testing this, I might be wrong, but I'm asking, would love your feedback on this. My increasingly, I'm growing into this insight that no, because it's all energy and consciousness first that then shows up at matter. If we have these conversations, we're actually patterning at like we are bringing forth a world into being. With it has like this conversation has agency right now.
Yes, and here's it just, one of the things about getting old is it kind of gives you a few more years. I don't believe it's a lot more wisdom, but a few more years of experience to reflect back on. Is that, yes, that's true, and it does not excuse us from continuously working to bring more intelligence and more understanding to every interaction and engagement, and to actually actualizing something, committing to bring something into being.
Mm.
So I think that it's like a both and. That is true. It's incumbent on us. We shift the energy field that we are working in when we are able to bring and sustain that nature of state and consciousness. And it allows then people in that same field to shift themselves.
Mm.
And so, but it's only good as long as that energy field exists. When we step out of it, and everybody has had this experience where they've gone someplace, they've had an extraordinarily exhilarating experience.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that someone we work with a lot, that you know, David McConville, and David did these extraordinary experiential events for years.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what he realized as he began to get more and more into this work was they were ephemeral. There were real changes occurred in people in that field,
Mm-hmm.
but it's ephemeral. So that's why learning practices and frameworks to shape how we see and think about the world and bringing the will and discipline to do that is the only way we can disrupt these deep patterns and be conscious of when those patterns are present. I mean, it's Krishnamurti's, one of my favorite quotes is, "You may think you're thinking your own thoughts. You're not. You're thinking your culture's thoughts."
Mm.
And most of the time we don't even know that. We're not conscious of it, that we're living out the patterns of the larger culture that we've been brought in. And so I just want to make sure that we don't, I lived through the hippie age and then through the 70s tea groups and all of that. And I just saw so much of a, drop out and be flower children
Mm-hmm.
as, because the world's so awful, I can't do anything about it. I really worry that we don't want to, we want to be very clear this is a rigorous practice that we're called to bring.
Yeah.
To bring that consciousness in the moment while we're still working on this incredible existential crisis.
Yeah.
But we're also working on who humans can become and be.
Yeah.
It's just having watched that through the decades. It's an incredibly important opportunity right now and when I think of what we are being called to step up to as a species, a role that's really different from even in indigenous communities. It's got to be grounded back in that consciousness and sense of all is kinship. That all is part of life. Even, we think of rocks as inanimate, but if you think in terms of the cycle of life, they were formed out of energy into form. They are dissolving, providing nutrients and energy into future cycles. If we start to collectively see life in that, see that sense of multiple time in the moment, what a difference that would make in how people make decisions in business and politics, in governance policies.
Yeah.
That's my vision.
Yeah. No, I think we're moving towards that, and the jury is out.
And you don't change. I mean, I think when you say, I sort of jumped on we need to have everybody. The other thing I experienced, and this was what I gained from working in large corporations, part of the sort of one of the fundamental beliefs in this is the power of developing an energy field and how it begins. We're always in energy fields, and they're shaping us whether we're conscious of them or not. If we're in the middle of a mob, it's very clear that is, but it's wherever we are. That's that sense of being processed by a place. We're being processed by the energy field of it. And one of the things that everybody kept saying who'd been around for a long time in the network when I joined was the biggest hazard is to feel like you have to touch everybody in a corporation to make the change.
Mm.
Create the field in one place, and others begin to be, one, drawn to it, or it begins to be carried out by those who really can carry that field with them. And it was quite amazing to see how, and you look at this in terms of major changes, the fall of the Soviet Union. There was not everybody got touched, but a field in the building, then you get a few lines of communication at critical points. And suddenly there's a step function shift that nobody could have predicted.
Mm.
And I think we're at one of those points now, because there's, I'm sure like you do, I track, I have a lot of alerts on different terms and so on, just to kind of get a sense of what's tracking in terms of what people are writing about, what people are proposing and so on in regard to regeneration and everything related to it. And, unless we do something really stupid, like set off a nuclear war, which our current president is capable of, unfortunately, my sense is that it's going to shift in ways we have no idea.
Yeah.
And cannot.
This reminds me of the, like your entry point earlier was that the personal experience of death and transcendence, and like of understanding that death is part of life, really brought you into this work. For me, that was one of the big insights when I first started reading about regeneration. Like it's actually the little book that Ethan Rowland and Gregory Landor called when there's a phrase like "design for your own death" when you design a regenerative enterprise. And I thought that was just such a brilliant question that our culture is blind to and actively avoids. And so there is this sense of also earlier I was reminded of Brian Goodwin, one of my mentors at Schumacher College, saying to me, Daniel, the secret of a fulfilling life is to be ready at every moment to give up who you are for what you could become, which is speaking very strongly to this, what needs to die in me. Or Bill was sharing yesterday that Regenesis group has these meetings where you actually declare, where you put yourself to death in order to be reborn. I think it's a wonderful practice. And I
Well,
feel like
it does relate to regeneration.
yeah, and it is like how do we really need to invite people to embrace some of the breakdown, chaos, and collapse that is now all around us as the unleashing of the potential. Like even you can frame it in complex systems terms. A complex dynamic system is most creative at the edge of chaos, when most of the structures that no longer serve and are anachronistic have broken down, and it's fragile then, but at the same time it has all the potential for reorganization and evolution. So I feel like that's where we at, and yeah, maybe
one of the ways we hold regenerationists go right back to it's I've seen a lot of definitions, renewal, restoration, and so on, sort of as the same thing. Regeneration is about going back to the source of generation. What was the source of the birth of something?
Mm-hmm.
And that's that essence that and then bring more life to it. So we're bringing more life to what is. So in a sense, it's like giving up what we are is to discover who we really are.
Mm-hmm.
What's really our unique essence. And this is, if we don't have that as a core fundamental, in a sense, it's the cosmology is a part of it, is how everything in the universe has its own unique essence pattern. This is Bohm. I mean, this is really straight his findings, and it's an ancient belief system, but Bohm's work in terms of the implicate order is the pattern of essence that's constantly informing how things get manifested in the explicate order. But above that is the super implicate, which is the sort of more unpatterned energies that inform that essence. So can we begin to have access to that whole scale and bring it forward in terms of how we're working and understanding and the consciousness we're trying to bring? We'll see a lot less of this trying to imprint on others what we think is what progress and what needs to happen. So we really deeply appreciate that and strive to understand and care about the essence that each of us holds. Every city, every neighborhood, every community.
That's it. Living the questions together.
Yeah.
That's what I use as a sort of catchphrase to run through my book, and it feels very akin to just staying willing to manifest the potential that lies in life as a, like Alfred North Whitehead's, the continuous exploration of novelty, but with a connection to the essence of what wants to be expressed, life itself.
You know, you were talking about indigenous cultures and belief systems and ways. The Vine who I'm sure you know of, was just an amazing person. And one of the things, he has a book on where he talks about education, he and Daniel Wyckoff. And what he speaks to is that you need to always start education starting with philosophy. And we don't, in the Western world, we start with our philosophy, our belief system are embedded and hidden. So we start with what needs to be done. And that's where we run into these things. So I think part of this is in this urgency of now of becoming conscious and creating the seedbed for coalescence and harmony is to start sharing more openly. What is the source of our beliefs about this? Why do we believe that? What's the philosophy that's behind what we're trying to do and the way we're trying to do it right now? And those kinds of conversations, having them in those moments of we've got to get moving, if we can take the discipline to say why and get to that fundamental belief and philosophy level, not in vast world sense, but right here, right now, in terms of what we're arguing about in New Mexico, about how do we actually phase out a coal plant and all the jobs that are going to be hit by it in a poor community. So we can argue about the large issues like global warming and so on, or we can start with, well, what do we really believe is right and good to do here, each of us? And what's our philosophy there, Brent? And can we start to see how those can come together? We don't have those kinds of conversations very often.
I do feel that there is a shift, though, that even in contexts like government offices or large corporations, it is much more possible to at least bring in this conversation. Whether they act on it is another question. But people are kind of seeing that they need a new approach. They need a fundamentally different way of.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it is happening, and we're pedaling like mad to help support that happen. And I think it is what will enable us. I mean, this is where I think one of the resonances with the powerful experience of Indigenous communities is when they are intact, you grow up in a whole cosmology and ontology. And then, so in taking care of kinships of the river and the salmon and so on, your culture, the culture you develop, reinforces that and gives people the support and guidance without laying down regulations and hard policies. You're continuously reinforcing it from a being level out. And so that cultural piece is really critical. It's one of the things we also work on, people being able to be more explicit and conscious about what are the dimensions of a culture that you really need to pay attention to, because they are signs of what the underlying belief is that may be long dead and frozen and no longer accurate, but it's still dominant in
even
that.
literally in the physical structures. Like in my PhD work, I was speaking a lot about how design goes on designing, and how when we live in a city, we might put like fiberglass and like new wires and new IT technology into the old town of Edinburgh. But as you walk through that space, you're still informed by some design decisions and frameworks that are 200, 300, 400 years old.
That's why ontological design is such a powerful way of thinking about that, because all the design thinking and everything else is to get the end product for the moment with the
Exactly.
It goes on designing its world for a long, long time afterwards. You're absolutely right.
Well, this has been wonderful. I'm conscious that I don't want to take up too much more of your time. But yeah, thank you so much for this conversation. And what I'll do is I'll if it's okay with you, I would share this on YouTube, and then
Sure.
write a blog post about it to get it to more people. And it's beginning of a conversation. And
Great.
hopefully,
And I'm assuming, because I tried to focus on, Daniel, and lift up was one dimension of our work. And I'm assuming that Bill and others that you will pick up the other dimensions, because I don't, it can get really kind of strange. Like I keep hearing people talking about, we do mental model trainings. We never use the word training. And we don't, a mental model is somebody else's explanation. It's not a means to be able to build one's own. So I want to, if we can just keep working away at
yeah. No, I'm trying. That's exactly why I'm starting this learning journey. For me, it's just a wonderful way of learning myself, and then sharing the learning with other people. They will hear what we've said differently than we heard what we've said. But yeah, I'm looking forward to getting this multifaceted perspective on the work. And the one thing that we maybe pick up some other time is this question of, now that there's such a buzz around regeneration, like I mentioned this briefly with Bill yesterday as well, like how do you avoid, because so many people are now taking bits from whatever is out there already, repackaging it in a clever way, in the way that they've always done that as consultants, to just make something buzzwordy and the new thing, and then go out there and say, sure, I can help you become a regenerative corporation. And on the one hand, maybe it's exciting that at least the word's out there and people are interested in it, and it's opening a much wider wedge for the conversation. But how do we invite people into a process of deepening that, even if it's just a small percentage of those people who are now tuning into this frequency, realize that this is actually committing to a long practice of self-reflection, personal development, capacity development with the people you work with in your community, in your team, and that then does the work in the world. It's not a quick
you keep
buzz.
showing that it's a much more effective way to do work on things.
Yes, that's exactly. It might seem slower, but in the end, it's faster. It's a good old.
Yeah. I mean, we've got to do that. That's that holding, simultaneously realizing more value, more meaning and significance, while actualizing something that has far greater effect and effectiveness and value in the existence world. We've got to do both.
Yes. And thank you so much.
Right.
I'll just quickly stop the recording. Just wanted to